Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law Podcast, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. We're a law firm that works solely on technology, cybersecurity, and legal issues. As a bit of background, in each episode, we look at stories in the law related to digital technology from around the world, with an emphasis on data protection and cybersecurity. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law UK, and I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Wright, and we're just going to be running through some stories which have been coming up this week. I will pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thanks, Amelia. My name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the managing director at Digital Law, and this week it's a special episode where the only thing we're going to discuss is one particular thing that's happened, and I'm now going to pass back to Amelia to tell us what it is.
Thanks, Peter. So, no doubt you will have heard, if you've been listening to our previous podcast, that we have spoken a lot about TikTok over the last few weeks. In actual fact, Peter, you even mentioned in our first episode of the year, you predicted that there might be a potential ban on TikTok. And so today we're going to be talking about the recent fine from the UK Information Commissioner, where they have fined TikTok 12.7 million for misusing children's data. So I'll pass over to Peter to really dig into this and why the misuse of children's data is a big red flag for us.
Indeed, and it goes to the heart of, I think, what a lot of the concerns that have been advanced in recent months about TikTok runs to. There apparently have been stories of children turning up at school who've not slept because they've just been using the infinite scroll on TikTok to keep scrolling through endless amounts of videos. Sometimes that content, of course, isn't curated for children. They could be looking at anything that's adult related, that could be harmful, that could be encouraging harmful behaviors such as self-harm or anorexia or depression, anxiety, mental illness, all these sorts of things. Depending on the interests of the viewer and how long they've looked at one video, the infinite scroll will then just continue to serve even more content of that type to you. And the issue here is that technically, if you're below the age of 13, you are a child in the UK and you shouldn't actually be using these platforms. Not just TikTok, it's the same when it comes to Meta's programs, so you shouldn't be therefore be using Instagram or Facebook, Snapchat. Literally, these are designed for adults and they contain adult content. And therefore, you shouldn't really have children scrolling through, seeing all that content, potentially engaging with others who we know full well that what people may look like online doesn't necessarily mean that that actually is them. So then we go down the rabbit hole into possible child abuse. But the point here is that the lack of controls restricting access to the platform for those below the age of 13 has meant that the UK Information Commissioner has levied a fine of 12.7 million. It's time limited, so this applies specifically to the period 2018 to 2020. Upon applying this fine, TikTok has, of course, turned around and said, well, our procedures have now improved and it is now much more difficult to get onto our system, and therefore we don't agree with the fine, has been the position advanced by TikTok.
But that is the position that has been advanced. But when we have previously looked at fines, such as the WhatsApp fine, the Meta fine, they have very quickly gone back and said, well, we're going to appeal this. We're going to appeal this decision. And even now, in our last few episodes, we have seen that Experian had appealed the decision against them. We covered that last week. And so the fact that they're not coming out and specifically saying we're going to appeal, rather kind of quite loosely saying, oh, we disagree with this, it does beg the question, doesn't it?
It does, but I think it's twofold. One is that I think it is unarguable that during that period, the ICO has said your mechanisms were not strict enough, and it is very difficult for them to go back and actually retrospectively say yes, they were, if they've done an assessment and said, well, they clearly weren't. The second thing is that it turns out that the ICO was looking at fining them a lot more.
27 million.
27 million, but that they have dropped an aspect of this fine related to unlawfully processing data related to sensitive data such as ethnic racial origin, and political opinions. So if we had sensitive data along with processing data of under 13s, it would have been 27 million. So clearly there has been a dialogue taking place for probably a fairly prolonged period of time, probably at least 2 years, I anticipate, on this, between the Information Commissioner and TikTok, whereby, having carried out an investigation, the ICO will have said 27 million on these grounds. There will have been some dialogue, some horse trading, and then a reduction down to the 12.7. And it may well have been a condition that we will reduce this to 12.7 on condition that you pay it now or fairly close to now, and furthermore that you do not then, you agree not to appeal this and then potentially drag it through the information tribunal or to try and judicially review it somehow. So therefore it's being stuck at that 12.7 million, and the Information Commissioner gets to have his day in the sun. We know that John Edwards likes to put himself forward as sort of the enforcer and the tough regulator. And in this way, the headline is 12.7 million being fined. It isn't 12.7 million asterisk and then brackets pending possible appeal proceedings that could take another 3 years, close brackets. So from that point of view, not only does it give the positive headline, it also allows John Edwards, in terms of his next stages in terms of regulatory enforcement against another organisation, he gets to go on the back of having applied this fine. He will probably then apply those similar techniques to try and get people to agree to straightforward fines like this, no appeal proceedings, and then being able to get that press coverage, show that he's being the enforcer, and building momentum like that in that way. So, I mean, 12.7 is not immense compared to when you look at the sort of tens and hundreds of millions of euro that have been applied in fines against Meta and Google by the European data protection regulators over the years. But it's a significant line in the sand, and I think it is interesting that this has come out right now. I mean, this is on the same day that Australia has banned TikTok from government devices, and we've been talking on this podcast in recent weeks over the sort of steady drip of other governments around the world banning the use of TikTok on government-issued mobile devices, and Australia is just the latest to join that long line.
Certainly, and I think as well it's important to mention that this is also in light of the Children's Code, which has been developed by the ICO to help protect children in the digital world. And so it's interesting that that is actually mentioned here in the story, because it is a statutory code of practice aimed at online services such as apps, gaming platforms, and social media sites. Therefore, this is likely to then apply to TikTok, Instagram, social media, and other recreational sites.
It will, and things like that Children's Code are a product of work by the Information Commissioner with other sort of government agencies. So there is a Children's Commissioner who is regularly publishing reports on the conditions that children are finding themselves growing up in the UK, and they have more than once referred to content on different platforms, and it could be potentially harmful, damaging, etc. So again, this piece of enforcement is something that not just the ICO, but some of those other agencies of government can point to say, look, we are taking action against these platforms to try and limit some of the harmful behaviours that we have been talking about, not just by the ICO, but other reports, other investigations that have been carried out over the last few years. And I think it's also interesting that they've been able to at least hit TikTok right now. Again, it's not just the fact that we've got those bans by other governments in terms of the use of it, but it's also just the explosion in TikTok's use. We've got 150 million users in the United States alone. It's the use of TikTok has skyrocketed both during the pandemic, during lockdown, and since. It is widely being downloaded by those around that age of 13 and teenagers, generally school-age children, whether they're below 13 or not. So a lot of teenagers are on there. We know that viewing figures by that demographic are down when it comes to television as a whole. I mean, why would you sit there and watch whatever's on BBC One when you can have whatever you want to see in the palm of your hand on TikTok, and have an infinite amount of it, not just 28 minutes and then another plug for another BBC product.
Not only that as well, you can skip past what you don't like. You just keep,
Exactly.
it is that level of continuous scroll. If you don't like it, you just kind of keep
you
going.
go somewhere else. So
yeah,
it will keep going for hours. It won't end up pausing for an advert break. Well, I'm sure it does serve adverts too, but it's not like the usual 5 minutes of adverts during the middle of something that you really want to watch. And you can watch it privately. You aren't stuck watching it with the family in the lounge. So it has that element of on demand that has meant that children can get what they want when they want. So in the face of that massive increase in users, this again is a very timely piece of enforcement.
One thing that we haven't really touched on in relation to TikTok as well is the feature of the TikTok shop, which is not something that we have previously mentioned. So this is essentially where, say, for example, you saw a product advertised on TikTok, you can then go and purchase that product directly. And so if you've got many users, particularly children, using this kind of software, it's very easy to influence them into just buying straight from TikTok shop. I mean, crikey, the amount of adults that I have heard that have also just been doing the same. They're like, oh, well, I saw it on TikTok and got it from the TikTok shop. It is quite easy to just see something and then click a button and then, great, you've bought this from the TikTok shop. Does it do what it says on the tin? Questionable.
So that's a very interesting observation, because when it comes to advertising on these sorts of platforms, people generally need to know that they have been advertised to. This goes back to the principle of subliminal advertising, which is banned in the UK. Subliminal advertising is the idea that you could make people think about something and then go and buy it without them knowing it. There was an example of this about 40 years ago now in a cinema. Remember then? And what they did was, during the showing of a movie, they replaced one of the celluloid. Wow, celluloid.
I was about to say, can
Yes.
you please explain this?
What's celluloid? So this is the, when we talk about film, film used to be celluloid that went through a machine.
Okay.
So you used to have the actual panels, the actual pictures, the moving pictures that create the motion picture. And indeed, that is old technology. But the point is that they invented this very sophisticated way of being able to advertise, because they replaced one screen of celluloid with a picture of a Mars bar. And then there was a massive rush on Mars bars during the intermission.
My favourite.
Compared to screens where they didn't have the Mars bar being shown.
Interesting.
But of course, the research showed that people did not realise, because it was going by so quickly, you wouldn't literally see a picture of a Mars bar. It's just the brain registers it and then thinks, oh, like a chocolate bar. Oh, I'd like one of them. And then it would just go off and buy, without people realising they had been influenced.
Yeah.
So that's quite an important principle when we think about it. So fast forward 30 years, and on social media there's been this principle around, if, for example, someone is putting up a post that is promoting something, you have to have hashtag ad, or the pound symbol has to go in there.
Promoted or something, you know.
So, for example, when Andy Murray won Wimbledon, the next day there was like a promoted piece of social media that went out saying, great winning Wimbledon, blah, 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 producing this with sponsor, click here, see this. And I think it was like a promotional thing for Adidas, his shirt sponsor. So that had to have, the pound symbol and the hashtag ad in it. So it has to be very, very clear. And occasionally influencers have fallen foul of that, where they've signed up for, all right, I'm going to now promote this platform, this piece of tech, whatever it might be. It could even be a piece of fashion, a hat, pair of shoes, whatever. It has to be clear. And very often influencers, in particular those who aren't sort of working, if they're sort of independent and then just being paid by a brand, oh, can you do this? And they haven't disclosed it. That's when they've sometimes faced enforcement from Ofcom in the past. So we'd be talking here about Ofcom regulation or Ofcom action potentially against that TikTok shop if they ever probably carried out a piece of regulatory enforcement, or if they had sufficient complaints made, they might turn around and say, well, are people buying stuff from the shop without actually really appreciating the fact that the thing that they saw on TikTok was specifically designed to entice and draw them into the shop to make that purchase?
Precisely.
And who knows if that will happen? We'd have to watch and see what Ofcom are looking at. I mean, interestingly, I think government regulators are getting hotter on looking at digital content as a whole. Indeed, we were talking to a web developer earlier today who ended up discussing takedown notices issued by the government's digital department, whereby these things are sent out where an organisation, at the moment it's only public sector bodies that are given these takedown notices, but they're called accessibility takedown notices. The point being that if a website is not sufficiently accessible by people who may have disabilities, so it could be visual impairment, audio impairment, they could have limited use of their limbs, so they can't necessarily access something in the way that an able-bodied person would. Well, if accessibility is not now built into a website to allow that, potentially these takedown notices can be issued, and then an organisation has got just 14 days to take it down, otherwise they will face enforcement. So we're seeing a general culture of more proactive regulatory enforcement from government, and that could include things like Ofcom looking into the shop, and we'll see if that happens. We don't know if it is happening. We're just surmising. This is opinion. Let's make that clear. But we've had this piece of enforcement against TikTok. We've had TikTok banned on government devices. And as a whole, we're seeing a more proactive approach to regulation, sometimes a fairly big, heavy-handed approach to regulation as a whole and enforcement by government regulators compared to sometimes in the past when it's been a little bit more light touch. You could almost think it's the government trying to find alternative ways of funding itself and raising revenue, but we couldn't possibly comment on that point, could we?
Oh, no, not at all. So that was kind of our main story of the day, and it's a bit of a different one from us. Normally we do tackle a range of stories, but I think this warranted its own podcast, don't you think?
I think it did, and if we get any more major bits of enforcement, we'll be giving them the same treatment. But I'm afraid, though, to those who think, does this mean they're going to stop talking about TikTok all the time? Probably not.
No.
But hopefully this will keep you going over the bank holidays that are coming up, because we're coming up to April and May, when every weekend seems to be a bank holiday. So it's just something to listen to while you're walking the dog or going for a run or doing whatever.
Thanks, Peter. So if you'd like to hear more from us, including subscribing to our newsletter, as well as receiving information about subscriber-only podcasts and webinars and additional events, then please subscribe to our premium via our Patreon channel using the link in the show notes. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for having to produce this podcast. And if you'd like to produce your own podcast or webinar, or you'd like to hear more about the Anson Evaluate services, please look at their website that you can find at www.ansonevaluate.com. These episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel, podcast channels such as Spotify and Apple Music, Amazon and Google Podcasts, and please feel free to leave us a review. And finally, if you have any questions about what we've talked about today, please email us at admin@digitallawuk.com. Thank you for listening.